This is the Spurscast with your host, Paul Garcia.
And welcome back to another episode of the Spurscast. On today's episode, I will be joined by Project Spurs writer Benjamin Bornstein. In this episode, Ben and I will discuss the Spurs in their last two games, another Jakob Poeltl trade rumor, and an update on top draft lottery player projections. Let's go and jump right into this episode with Ben. Ben, how you doing?
I'm fantastic, man. How are you?
I'm doing very well. You know, like I said, we've seen the Spurs this season come together now, and they have the fourth worst record. So it's going to be good to have you on and kind of talk about some players in those lottery projections. So before we do that, Ben, let's go ahead and jump first into how the team's doing since I last recorded a week ago. So they've only played 2 games since I last recorded. They're 1-1 and since the last Spurscast episode. So let's go back to Sunday. They lost against the Sacramento Kings in San Antonio by 13. This was a close game for about a half. Then the Kings got a double-digit lead. The Spurs got it down to 6 midway through the fourth, but the Kings ended up winning with a comfortable win by 13 points. The spur of the game on this night was Jakob Poeltl. He posted 23 points, 7 rebounds, 2 assists, and 2 blocks. Then on Tuesday, the Spurs hosted the Brooklyn Nets without Kyrie, Irving, and without Kevin Durant, both players on the injured list. And the Spurs ended their 5-game losing streak with a win by 8 points against the Nets. This one was pretty much close throughout, but San Antonio was able to hold on. Keldon Johnson had himself a career-high night on different areas. He ends up with 36 points, which is a career high. He snags 11 rebounds, 4 steals, another career high. And so the Spurs should have gone 0-2, but instead they ended up going 1-1. Let's go through where they're at through 45 games. They have the 28th ranked offense. That hasn't really changed much. The defense is still 30th in the league. Their net rating is still 30th. They still have a better record than the Rockets out west. They're 14-31, 14th out west. And then lastly, they have the 4th worst record in the league, which that hasn't moved at all. Despite them going on a 5-game losing streak, they really haven't moved positioning in terms of down at the bottom of the bracket of the league. And so that would mean 12.5% overall pick odds. And so one thing I'm going to start doing on the Spurscast going forward is every time I mention that about the worst record for them, I'm going to use Tankathon's draft simulator and see how many times it takes me to get the number 1 pick for the Spurs. Just last night when I prepped these notes, it took me 8 tries before I finally got the Spurs with the first pick. So Ben, I know that's a lot of information. What are your thoughts just kind of on how this season's gone? Because I know I haven't had you on since I think like October or September. So I'm going to just hear your thoughts on the Spurs as a whole from their perspective and then where their record's at.
Absolutely. Always light the beam. I am loving that this season. I'm very happy for Sacramento fans that team has suffered, and it looks like they finally got their act together. So it's nice to see for them. And I'm a huge Domantas Sabonis fan, so good for him. And he's actually playing on a good team, so very good stuff. Spurs are infuriating if you want to see them lock in a top 3 pick. They're the 4th worst team right now. And it's, you look at the other 3 teams, it's Houston, Detroit, Charlotte. Detroit, understandable. Cade Cunningham is out for the rest of the season. He underwent surgery and he was out. That was fairly early on in the season. Charlotte missed LaMelo Ball for a lot of weeks. And even with him back, they have not played well at all. It's infuriating, mostly because this was a year where the Spurs really could have used them getting into the playoffs. The Spurs own that pick. It's lottery protected. So if they get into the lottery, obviously not great for the Spurs. And I think the pick becomes less protected each year afterwards, and it diverts into like 2 second-rounders or something. It sucks. So ideally, the Hornets would have been decent this year, but alas, they're the Hornets. Thanks, LaMelo Ball. But Spurs, you said it. The offense is really bad. The defense is excruciatingly bad. I think it was Noah Magaro George who said that they're on pace to have the worst defense in NBA history.
Man.
That seems bad. Hot take, that's bad. So they've got to turn something around. Part of it is the perimeter defense is not great right now. And so you're funneling people into Jakob Poeltl, who's trying to protect the rim at all costs. And he gets made to look bad at times because he's gone to leave his man to go help someone else because they couldn't keep a guy in front of him. It's not great. So Spurs, very hard to watch, except for those few nights where Keldon Johnson had a career high points. What else was it? Steals. So, you get a gem like that every now and then. And with Devin Vassell out for the foreseeable future, that also hurts the Spurs, or it helps them if they can tank better, or if other teams don't tank as well. Charlotte, but fourth worst odds in the league. It could be worse. They could be, I don't know. They really could be Houston, who are actually worse and really have no idea what they're doing, it seems. Yeah. So there's that. But I think you and I are going to get into this a little later, but at number 4, if the Spurs pick at 4, there are some options.
Okay. Yeah, we're definitely going to get into that in a little bit here. I would just say like one big difference though, with watching the Spurs, because I have to watch every game since I talk about them every week here on this podcast, is the thing that I noticed is that yes, there's that trend where they fall behind by double digits, they end up losing the game. They're like 0-30, 0-29 with that record when they fall behind by double digits. But at least they battle back a lot of times. It's not that often that they get blown out, like just get blown out by 30 points. That doesn't happen too often. You just this team definitely has some fight in them, even though the record doesn't quite show it. So that's one thing. Is like sometimes these games can be entertaining because the Spurs do at least compete. And they really fight hard on certain nights, despite their overall record. All right, so Ben, so before we get into the draft talk about some of the prospects, let's first look at some latest trade rumors, because like we know the trade deadline is coming up in the next few weeks here in early February. So we're going to see Jakob Poeltl, Doug McDermott, Josh Richardson, and different kind of trade rumors. And so there were 2 big rumors this past week out of The Athletic from 2 of their different writers. So let's first go back to Tuesday. On Tuesday, Shams Charania wrote a big piece about different players that are being discussed in trade rumors, and Jakob Poeltl was one of those players. He actually made like the headline of this article. It was called NBA Trade Deadline: What Shams is Hearing About Jakob Poeltl, John Collins, Fred VanVleet, and more. Now, I did a very detailed video breakdown on Project Spurs Network TV YouTube page. So if you want to visit that, you can go ahead and check that out. And I go into more detail there. And so just a quick summary of this article. Shams reports that the Celtics and Raptors both have interest in Jakob Poeltl. The Celtics have different ways to build a trade package with different veterans on the roster. Gallinari's contract would likely be needed, but a third team would probably be needed because Gallo can't come back directly to the Spurs since they just waived him, and then he ended up signing with Boston. The Celtics have a lot of first-round picks. They have 5 first-round picks without any kind of conditions on them up until 2029. As for the Raptors, they're in a similar boat where they have multiple veterans that they can use in a trade package, like Thad Young or Kem Birch, that can be created. They also have a lot of first-round picks. They have 7 first-round picks with no conditions up until 2029. And then on Wednesday, I just saw this rumor. Jared Weiss, also of The Athletic, reported that the Spurs have let all teams interested in Poeltl know that their starting line for getting Poeltl is 2 first-round picks. They're basically telling teams, okay, you want to get in the Jakob discussions? Our starting line here is 2 first-round picks. What are your thoughts, Ben, on these latest trade rumors surrounding Jakob Poeltl?
I mean, there's nothing wrong with wanting 2 first-round picks for Jakob Poeltl. And frankly, if you're the Spurs, you have to start negotiating somewhere. Because if you just outright say, well, we want 3 first-round picks, you're not getting any nibbles on that. People are just saying, well, you're outrageous. Obviously, you're not here for realsies. Yes, GMs say realsies. But, starting with 2 first-round picks as a want or need for Jakob Poeltl is not outrageous. It's not unreasonable. It will probably come down, but that is at the very least a starting place teams are willing to go with for a trade. And if depending on which team it is, it could be 2 later first-round picks, which first-round picks still valuable, so it's fine. But because if you're not trading him to a team like Toronto, who's not really competing. You're certainly not trading him to a team like Houston or Charlotte, who are not competing. I mean, you're trading him, like you mentioned, potentially to a Boston. But if they do that, then they're saying, we don't have faith in Al Horford. We don't have faith in Robert Williams, which I'm sure they do. And, as we speak, Al Horford has gotten out to a really nice start in the Celtics game tonight. So that certainly isn't going to help that case. But Celtics, maybe they're in the market for a guy like Doug McDermott, known shooter, we'll keep the floor spaced for them. They have a couple of guys who aren't really spacers. I mean, you could potentially play him with Jason Tatum, or he comes on for Jason Tatum at times, and you make sure you're playing with Jaylen Brown so that you're not losing too much defense if you're the Celtics. Because I think anybody who's watched some Spurs games knows Doug McDermott, not a defensive specialist. Yeah. But what you mentioned with the Raptors, I like Khem Birch. I would imagine it would be hard to convince Thad Young to come back to San Antonio after what happened here with him, in the last couple of years. So I'm not sure that happens, but those 7 first-rounders up through 2029 are super tempting. The Spurs might try and make something happen. OG Anunoby is apparently on the trading block, but if you're the Spurs, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because then you'd be trading kind of one foundational-esque player for another. Not to say that Jakob Poeltl should be the foundation of every team, but a team like the Spurs makes perfect sense. Not to say that he wouldn't help other teams either. I am a huge Jakob Poeltl fan. Yeah. Do not get that confused. But yeah, there's definitely some trade partners out there the Spurs can be looking at. I have a feeling there might be someone who pops out of nowhere that feels like, you know what, we're more of a contender than people realize. We're going to make a real big swing here. We're going to give up some picks in the future because we think with this acquisition, we're going to be competing, so the picks won't be that high anyway. I have a gut feeling something like that may happen, but the two options you presented are much more logical than what I just did.
Yeah, and one thing I want to go back to what Weiss said is, and he had a good point here, was that he says that the Spurs, we're asking for 2 first-round picks last year for Derek White. They were telling teams that were interested in Derek White, 2 first-round picks as the starting line. And so they ended up getting 1 first-round pick. Then they got that one from Boston. I think it's like in 2028. So they ended up almost getting that, even though it has like some protections on it. So that's just something to watch. Is like, yes, they may get like an unprotected first-round pick for Poeltl, but then also maybe like a protected one from that team. So again, even though it sounds like a lot, teams may negotiate with San Antonio. So that's kind of the latest on Jakob Poeltl and trade rumors surrounding him. And now the last thing, our last topic here we want to discuss now is the lottery. I know it's only January. Ben and I are recording, but I just wanted to get a check-in because the only 2 names I've ever heard of since the summer is Victor Wembanyama. Of course, he's going to be the consensus number 1, and then Scoot Henderson, the consensus number 2. So right now, I haven't really done a draft board, but I finally put one together just last night, and I was really interested to see. All I wanted to do is see is who's in the top 5 because, like we said, the Spurs right now have the 4th worst record, and it's gonna they don't have those 14% lottery odds right now. They're only at that 13% range, and so it's not guaranteed that they're even going to get a top 3 pick here, or the number 1 overall pick. So what happens in the event that they don't get Victor or Scoot Henderson? Where do they go then? And so that's where I got interested in seeing some of these players who are popping up on different draft boards, on different mocks. And so I have Ben on, and he's going to kind of tell us about each player, with more background on each player. So at number 3, Ben, the 3 players that I see a lot on the mocks are Amen Thompson, 6'7" out of Overtime Elite. 4 mocks mentioned him. Brandon Miller, 6'9" out of Alabama. 3 mocks mentioned him. And then Nick Smith Jr., 6'5" out of Arkansas. 2 mocks mentioned him. So I'd like to know just a little bit about these players. Who are they? And then where would you rank? What preference would you want of the Spurs to take them if they got that 3rd pick?
Yeah, Amen Thompson right now, if he was in the league, top 1% athleticism. That is how athletic he is. He's that fast. He has that kind of bounce. He has creative finishes at the rim. It is ridiculous. I would probably take him at 3 right now.
Okay.
But I would still like to see some more from Overtime Elite because that league is it is hard to get a sense of how competitive that league is at times because it's definitely better than high school ball, but it is certainly not at the level of college ball. And I'm not sure it's at like a post-grad year of high school level. I don't know where it falls. So I have a hard time putting some of that stuff into context, but the athleticism stuff, you can very clearly see it with Amen Thompson. His biggest issue is shooting right now. He is not a consistent shooter really from anywhere outside of like 8 feet on the court. Okay. He has been working on it. He knows that's a weakness. That is something he is constantly working on. It is a matter of it just has to show up.
Okay.
Brandon Miller, I've seen him moving up. He was, I think even before the season, he was very much a top 10 lock. A few weeks into the season, people were convinced, okay, top 5. I get it. And like you have here, 3 mock drafts have him at number 3 right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which I get. I understand. And I wouldn't hate that pick at 3 either. And I've watched him in college, and I love his game in college. I think he's going to be fantastic at the next level. Really, if you're picking at 3 between him and Amen Thompson, it comes down to the guy who's put up numbers and has productions in the collegiate ranks. And I think Brandon Miller is actually a little older. I think he'll be 20 by the time the draft comes around. So that is another factor. But Brandon Miller at 3 is really not the worst thing you could do. For me, he's at 4. I think he would be great at 4. Nick Smith Jr. scares me right now. A lot of people have him top 5, but he's been dealing with injuries a lot of the year. He has not played a whole lot of games, and when he did play those games, he was not 100% himself. So that the way he is mocked right now, it is purely on potential and what people saw in high school and a little bit of flashes from what he's shown at Arkansas. But there's another guy on here from Arkansas, Anthony Black, who has played every game and has looked very good, and I like him a lot. Having said that, I don't think I'd like Nick Smith at 5 unless I watch him more. Again, it's only January. He has, basically through March to play more games. And if he doesn't, you're really going to have to get a feel for him at the combine, which can be a scary prospect because if he has a phenomenal day at the combine, you can say, no, well, this is everything you get a little bit of confirmation bias. And it's, well, this is everything we thought he'd be. Or if he has one really bad day at the combine, it's, oh no, this is our worst nightmare. It's all coming down. But and then you have to hear about what he might do in workouts. Mm-hmm. So it's tough with him right now, but I don't think he would be my number 5 right now. Maybe down the road after he's played some more games, but not right now.
Just real quick, Amen Thompson, overtime lead. Isn't that where Dominic Barlow came from?
That is where Dominic Barlow came from. Yes.
Okay, that's interesting too, because he really hasn't, played.
There for people who really want to get ahead on the draft on the next year's draft, there's a guy he's a top 5 player in the 23 recruiting class. He's going to Kentucky. Dillingham is in that class, is playing at Overtime Elite now. He was at the Donda Academy until that shuttered. Then he moved over to Overtime Elite, so he's actually playing in that league as well if you really want to get ahead on watching some guys.
Oh, okay. All right, so now let's go ahead and look at some of the prospects at number 4. So you've already talked about Amen Thompson. He's been mentioned at 4 in 4 mocks. Nick Smith Jr., you spoke about 2 mocks. Brandon Miller, you mentioned. Here's 2 new players, though. Cam Whitmore, 6'7" out of Villanova. He popped up once at number 4, and then Anthony Black, who you mentioned, 6'7" out of Arkansas, popped up once at number 4. What are your thoughts on Whitmore and Anthony Black?
So I'm going to start with Anthony Black. I really like Anthony Black's game. He's smooth. He's not yet a knockdown shooter, but he's shown some flashes. So I'd feel comfortable saying he can develop. But he's been playing really well. He's been the primary point guard for Arkansas, and there have been a lot of times where he's asked to kind of do everything for them. They've lost some players. Nick Smith has been playing, and they lost a huge transfer in Trevon Brazil. So he's been asked to step up and do a lot, and I would argue he has been doing that. Granted, he's not hitting a lot of his threes on volume. I mean, he's shooting 2.9 a game, and he's hitting 32% of them, but it feels like a lot of those are forced shots because he becomes the offense at times. And, despite that, he's still shooting about 46% from the floor as a whole. Averaging 5 rebounds, almost 4 assists a game, over 1.5 steals, 12.5 points. So very solid player. I like him. The production is there. Arkansas has been bad in SEC play right now, and that's That has nothing to do with Anthony Black, I would say. He has been great. He's been the reason that they've been in some of the close games they've played in the conference already. Right now, it doesn't feel like he has enough help around him.
Okay. All right, and so now let's go to number 5. Some players that pop up here. We have Brandon Miller again, who you mentioned, who's popped up on 2 mocks at 5. Nick Smith Jr., Cam Whitmore, 2 mocks. And then here's a new player, All-Star Thompson, 6'7" out of overtime elite as well. He's been mentioned twice at number 5. Jarris Walker, 6'8" out of Houston, mentioned once. And then Grady Dick, 6'7" out of Kansas. What's some intel on Thompson, Walker, and Grady Dick?
So I didn't get a chance to talk about Cam Whitmore. I will do that quickly.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, because he's mentioned here.
Yeah, he was a guy who had an injury as well to his wrist before the season started, but he is 6'7", I think he's 220 or 225, and he has every bit of that. He is all muscle. He is strong. He drives well and finishes through contact because of that. He's got to show a little more shooting consistency on a little more volume. He's a solid shooter right now. He's shooting 36% on threes about 4 times a game.
Okay.
So it's there, and his field goal percentage is 48% because he's very much either a 3 or I'm trying to dunk on you. Oh, okay. So, either at the rim or 3-pointers. That's about it for him. Not a whole lot of mid-range. As far as All-Star Thompson goes, Amen's twin brother, if Amen is top 1% NBA league athleticism, All-Star Thompson is still top 10%. Oh. He is also an excellent athlete. He's a little bit more consistent in his shooting, but he's not as much of a playmaker as his brother. Amen is very much an oversized point guard. He can run your offense. He finds guys cutting. He's a good passer. Also, Thompson has a little bit of that. He's not quite as what's the word I'm looking for? He's not quite as polished in that area as Amen is, but also Thompson's still a phenomenal player. He's a guy who I've seen consistently in the top 10 of mock drafts. I imagine there's no way he falls below that. So, okay, very good player in that regard. Jarris Walker, he's 6'8", but he plays like he's 7 feet tall. He is. I think he's 6'8". He might be 240, and he is all muscle too. That kid is strong. He will bully anybody. He has a little bit of a mid-range game. He'll post in the mid-post and get a shot off from there or get low and get to the rim. He's been an improved 3-point shooter this year. That was a concern coming in, and he's shown that he can hit them. As far as Grady Dick goes, professional shooter. Okay. Can get his shot off very quickly. Great release. It's high. It's quick. It's everything you want in a shooter. He almost reminds me of Cam Johnson when he was at UNC. Okay. A guy who, if you give him any sort of space, he can get his shot off, and he will more than likely make it. He's a very confident shooter. As far as defense goes, he is not a total negative. He's probably got to get stronger, but he knows where he's supposed to be. He knows how to move. It's a matter of just getting a little faster and probably a little stronger so that he can hold his ground with some of the power forwards in the league.
Sorry, let me go back to the page. I want to ask you one more question before we end this episode here. Going back to the list here of players. Is there a player on this list out of 4 and 5 that you feel would be a stretch? Like you wouldn't take them at 4 or 5? Is there someone who's like, because I feel like Grady Dick was one player who was like in most mocks, he was like, either in after 10, but it was like one that had him at 5. Is there somebody who like stands out who you wouldn't probably take there at 4 or 5?
Yeah, Grady Dick at 5 is very much a reach. And I think Anthony Black at 4 is a reach. Oh, okay. I would say Anthony Black right now might be like a top 7 guy. So, I mean, it's depending on what you're looking for, it may not be that much of a reach. But I think him at 4 is a little high. I'd say Jarris Walker at 5 could be a scary prospect for teams. Yeah. I still think he's a lottery guy, but he's probably closer to like 8 or 9, I would say.
So let's say that, I think you actually answered this question. So I'm just saying, unfortunately, the Spurs don't get the top 3 picks, 1, 2, or 3. And let's say Amen Thompson ends up going number 3. So who's that number 4? Let's just say that they go by the record, and that's where the Spurs are supposed to finish right now. They have the 4th worst record. Who would you take at 4. If Thompson's gone, Wembanyama's gone, and Scoot Henderson are gone.
I think I go Brandon Miller. I mean, that's
Brandon
a guy.
Miller, okay.
I know you have a Jeremy Sohan who's also a 6'9" guy. Who's going to be your top-notch defender, but Brandon Miller can defend a bit. But that kid can create for himself and shoot it. I mean, you have to. I think you have to take Brandon Miller at 4 there. I would not feel great about Nick Smith at 5. I think there are enough point guards in this draft. You could, if you're the Spurs, you could find a guy early in the second or potentially trade in late to the first round.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, the reason why it was really interesting to get into this is just because, like, I know that we're seeing the Spurs go through this really tough season where they're not even they're really bad compared to what we're used to in San Antonio, but they're also not that bad because they're not bad enough to where they're even end up in those top 3. And even if they get one of the bottom 3 records, there's no guarantee they get number 1, 2, or number 1 or even number 2. So I think we just got to prepare. Not only myself because like as media covering this team, but also even like the fans that are watching the games. Like, yes, we know this is rough, and there's still a chance though that they're not going to end up with Victor Wembanyama at the end of this. And so we got start looking at other players though in the event that doesn't happen.
Absolutely. I mean, this and even if you have the 4th best odds, because the percentage has been flattened out a bit with the 4th worst record, you could still end up with the top pick.
For sure. Yeah. Hopefully it doesn't take the 8 tries that I needed to.
Yeah.
That would not be good. All right. So thanks, Ben, for helping us out there. Just kind of getting us perspective on these different draft lottery prospects. And of course, Spurscast listeners, as March Madness gets closer, we're going to have Ben on more often. Once the season ends, we're going to definitely have Ben more often, especially as that draft does approach and we get closer to the lottery, seeing if the Spurs can land the number 1 overall pick. Thanks to Ben for joining me here on this episode of the Spurscast. I also want to say thank you to Joe Garcia for mixing and producing this episode. From all of us at Project Spurs, stay safe. Great.